Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of A Short History. Our 36th president was born on August 27th, 1908. Good old Stonewall, Texas, baby. Johnson and his four younger siblings grew up poor in rural Texas without any electricity or running water. And his formative education occurred in this one-room schoolhouse that still stands today. In 1913, the Johnson family moved to Johnson City, Texas, where LBJ attended Johnson City High School and would accompany his father in Austin to watch the political debates. Upon graduating, Johnson left home for several years, going to California with his buddies, and eventually enrolled in Southwest Texas State in San Marcos, Texas. After taking a year off of the school to teach a segregated Mexican-American school, Johnson graduated in 1930 with a bachelor's in education. Surprisingly, the newly elected congressman from Corpus Christi, Texas, Richard Kleber, asked for Johnson to become his aide in D.C. and gave him plenty of opportunities to do political work. On top of his congressional responsibility, Johnson enrolled at Georgetown University, taking night classes to pursue a degree in law. On a trip back to Texas in 1934, LBJ met Alta Lady Bird Taylor, whom he asked to marry on their first date, Riz, and 10 weeks later, they were married. In 1937, Johnson quit his NYA director job to run for U.S. Representative of the Texas 10th Congressional District, which he won handily at the age of 29. As a representative, Johnson supported Roosevelt's New Deal programs and successfully brought electricity to the impoverished Hill County, Texas that he represented in 1939. In 1941, Johnson ran and lost to the conservative Governor W. Lee Pappy O'Daniel for the Senate seat in Texas. When the U.S. was attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Johnson left his House seat to join the armed forces, becoming an active service member in the Pacific Theater and earned a Silver Star for his service. In 1948, Johnson began his campaign for the Senate seat, and he won. As a senator, LBJ helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and his subcommittee work led to the creation of NASA in 1958. While he felt ready to run for president by 1960, Johnson fell short in the primary to President hopeful John F. Kennedy, who eventually asked Johnson to join him as vice president to garner Southern support. As Kennedy's VP, Johnson was head of the space program, estimating that the U.S. could reach the moon by 1967 or 1968. In preparation for his 1964 run, Kennedy brought his campaign to Texas to unite the Democratic Party. However, his trip changed the course of American history forever. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One and immediately began working. In 1964, Johnson passed his most significant piece of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Supported by his communications with significant civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Johnson was able to push the legislation through Congress. This act outlawed segregation and discrimination across America. Upon beating Hubert Humphrey in 1964, Johnson pushed his Great Society program through Congress, a series of bills that combated poverty and urban decay, and included the establishment of Medicare and Medicaid. Johnson also passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which banned poll taxes and many other obstacles in the rights of Americans to vote. Amongst all his domestic achievements, however, Johnson's legacy was forever tarnished by one critical mistake in a small country in Southeast Asia. While the U.S. had been involved in Vietnam for almost 20 years, Johnson, prompted by the dubious Gulf of Tonkin incident, ordered the first 3,500 Marines to South Vietnam, which swelled to over 500,000 troops by the end of his presidency in 1968. The controversial nature of the war and its high number of American casualties caused domestic unrest at home, so much so that protests occurred often in D.C. and around the nation. Support for Johnson had plummeted, and when it came time for the next election cycle in 1968, Johnson decided not to run for re-election. Post-presidency, LBJ moved back to Stonewall, Texas, his birthplace, and lived the next 5 years on his ranch before dying of a heart attack on January 22, 1973. Lyndon Baines Johnson served nearly 6 years as one of the most complex and fascinating presidents, and one who did so much for the American people but fell short in a war that was almost unwinnable. But he is my favorite president for sure. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for more short histories in the future. I will see you guys in the next one.